Welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick.
And I'm Arin Babbick.
Last episode, we covered the events leading up to January 28th, 1986. The red flags, the ignored warnings, and the relentless pressure to launch Challenger despite serious concerns.
And let's be clear, the engineers did take those concerns seriously. They practically begged NASA management to delay the launch. But management, well, they had a schedule to keep and a PR narrative to maintain.
And we all know how well ignoring safety concerns turns out.
Today, we're covering the launch itself. 73 seconds that began with hope and ended in catastrophe. We'll break down what actually happened in those final moments, what the public saw, and what they didn't.
We'll also talk about the infamous O-ring failure, the myths surrounding the explosion, and the horrifying reality that for the crew of the Challenger, the disaster didn't end when the cameras cut away.
It's a tough story, but it's one worth telling. Not just to honor the astronauts who were lost, but to understand how and why this happened, and to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself.
This is Catastrophe Chronicles.
Part 2 of the Challenger disaster starts now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We're so happy you're here.
Absolutely. I've been just so happy watching our numbers over the last couple of weeks.
It's been very cool.
And the slow growth, but it's just really fun.
It's really
cool.
fun. I think somebody may have mentioned us somewhere because we had a couple of really big days of numbers. And
oh, yeah?
If somebody did, guys, let me know.
And thank you so much.
And thank you so much. I want to be able to actually thank them, though, not just through the anonymous podcast airwaves.
Right.
So yeah, shoot me a message if somebody mentioned us somewhere because we got a lot more numbers than I expected. And yeah, where'd y'all come from? It's nice to meet you. Welcome back. I hope nobody's too mad at me about splitting the Challenger into 2 episodes. But here we are. You get part 2 now. We're ready.
And hopefully no one will be able to hear it after editing. But if there's kind of like a low hum in the background, it's colder here now. Virginia, our part of Virginia.
Aaron's very nicely saying that I'm weak and I don't handle the cold well. And I insisted on having a space heater in the room while we're recording because...
along with all your layers.
Well, I have a jacket, my big thick undershirt, my 2 blankets, and my very thick sweatpants. And I'm still not warm enough. I'm done with being cold. I'm really, really done with being cold.
So apologies. But that's the potential background noise. Hopefully it won't be a detractor.
Hopefully I can edit it out. I think I can. I have faith in myself. It's fine. We're fine. Anyways, so here we are. We're ready to talk about death, destruction, and mayhem.
Mm-hmm.
I got a little bit more serious in the intro this week because this episode for the actual explosion of the Challenger and then next week for the Columbia, these are really close to my heart disasters. Through a combination of a couple of things, both because the Columbia is one of the first disasters I followed in real time after 9/11.
Oh, really?
I watched it. I didn't watch it live when it broke apart, but I heard about it really quickly, and it was in the early era of online news. So I was looking that up when my parents didn't know and watching the 24-hour news coverage of it. And then that led me to trying to figure out the Challenger because everyone was talking about Challenger, and Challenger happened before I was born. So I didn't follow the Challenger in real time, but learning about it was such a dagger in the heart because I love NASA. I love space. I love all that kind of stuff. And I've always really looked up to NASA. And the dagger back then, and then digging deeper into it now. I had dug deeper over the years and learned more about it because I like learning about that kind of stuff. But getting really into the nitty gritty of it over the last couple of weeks is it's very heartrending on a lot of different levels, from the fact that it was completely and totally avoidable for the Challenger to really understanding each of the people, because this is not one where you have thousands of deaths. There's 7 people.
Yeah.
And I know each one of them, and I feel like I know them personally now. And not that any death is okay or anything like that, but this one just felt more serious. So we'll still make jokes because we're dumb, and that's what we do.
we mask with humor.
Da 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 da! It's fine. We're fine. Everything's fine. So we are drinking a ChatGPT drink tonight.
Oh yeah?
Called 73 Seconds.
Oh God. Yeah.
I asked ChatGPT what I should make for a cocktails night because I couldn't figure out what to do. And that is what they did. This drink has rum, blue Curaçao, Curacao, lemon juice, and champagne.
Ooh.
And it's tasty. Yummy, yummy.
It is.
And I like that ChatGPT immediately knew 73 seconds because that's how long it took for the challenger. So
Chat for the win.
that's where we are. You ready to dive in?
I'm ready to blast off.
Do you think we can... Really? Lord. Do you think we can make this episode less than 2 hours this time?
That's up to you.
Really? I have faith in me. It's fine. We got this.
How long are your notes?
The notes today are 23 pages.
Oh, that's better than the last one.
The last one was 27.
I have faith.
It's fine. We're good. So our quote for today. Obviously, a major malfunction. This was Steve Nesbitt, 41 seconds after the Challenger looked like it exploded on live TV.
All right.
Obviously, major malfunction. We will get to that. Where we left off last week, we went through just tons of data and tons of moments where they knew this O-ring was a problem. And we talked about several other problems that the shuttles were having and several other things that were going wrong that were being ignored. Engineers have reached a point of, it doesn't seem like their information is getting up to the places it needs to get to. It's very clearly obvious that there is a problem with safety culture at NASA. And we have reached all the way to the winter of 1985. So that is where we are going to kind of pick up timeline-wise. The year of 1986 for NASA was supposed to be a pretty landmark year, though I guess it was landmark year, just not in the way they wanted it to be. They had...
Low blow.
Sorry. Here's what it is, though. They had 15 launches scheduled for that year, including 9 different communication satellites, 2 scientific probes of the solar system, and 3 secret military payloads. This was also the year they were going to launch the Hubble telescope.
Oh, really?
And there's a lot of work being done on that because Halley's Comet was going to pass by the Earth, the closest it hadn't. The closest it was going to before 2061.
Wow.
So they were going to be working on that kind of stuff. And they do a little bit of that on the Challenger mission, or they were going to do a little bit of that on the Challenger mission. So that's kind of what NASA is looking at. They're pushing hard to get to that point. It's very, very cold. On top of, all these other things, at the end of 1985, our pal James Beggs, do you remember him?
Refresh my memory.
He's the administrator of NASA at this point. And
Okay.
he is... I wouldn't say he's necessarily the best at everything because obviously under his purview, there was a lot of problems still. But he did make a pretty concentrated effort. When things made it across his desk, he made sure that they got fixed. And a lot of the problem was that things didn't make it to his desk.
Yeah, we talked about that in the last episode where it was middle management was keeping things under wraps so that they could, because they were under all this pressure to go.
Yep, go fever. Now, I don't want to exonerate senior management because senior management was creating a culture that made middle management feel like that. But James Beggs was certainly not the worst of everyone. And when things made it to him, he did fix them. Unfortunately, in 1985, in December of 1985, he was indicted by a grand jury in a corruption case.
Oh, wow.
This corruption case it was basically politically motivated. It had been brought on by Reagan ideologues who wanted to put somebody who is more military friendly and was more willing to get things going faster in his place. And James Beggs didn't want to militarize space. He didn't want these things to happen. So there's a lot of kind of at odds with Reagan's White House. And this was, one of the OG political witch hunts. So he ended up stepping down. He didn't leave the agency. He just kind of went down the hall and was no longer the acting administrator.
Okay.
And in his place, William R. Graham was put in as acting administrator. This man was pretty desperately unqualified for the position. He didn't have a science background. He didn't have a lot going for him other than he was a party loyalist and he was willing to militarize space and he was willing to push and make things go as fast as they could with a promise that he was going to cut the budget even further.
Yeah, wow, that doesn't sound
familiar at all.
At all. Why is it that I say that every episode?
Because we just are repeating history over and over and over again.
Oh. Okay. You're going to make me mad again, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. You're going to be so mad. So Beggs is down the hall. Beggs told Graham, basically, this is a really difficult agency to run. And I know you're coming in here to kind of shake things up, but I'm here, man. Just call me when you get in over your head. And with that, he ended up dispatching like NASA spies, people that were loyal to him in the agency, who would report on Graham back to Biggs, and just more interdepartmental hostility, more problems. This led to morale going to an even further low, because now you not only have somebody who doesn't really believe in the mission that most of the people there believe in, but their actual boss is still in the damn building, or their old boss that they love is still in the same building, and he's now like sending out spies and stuff. So it's not a great time to be at NASA as of December 1985.
Yeah, that sounds like a wonderful working environment.
Right? Before we go a ton further into all the kind of things that happened with Challenger, I wanted to take a moment at the top of the episode here, now that we've gotten those things done, to talk about the 7 astronauts that flew on the Challenger mission, both because I think it's important to recognize them, and also because as we go through these things, I wanted to kind of have a picture of who we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first one was Francis R., or Dick Scooby. He was the commander of the mission. He was born on May 19th, 1939 in Washington. He had an absolute passion for aviation. He earned his pilot's license and his mechanic's certification very quickly. He was in the Air Force. He served as a combat aviator during the Vietnam War. And then he became a test pilot and was selected as a NASA astronaut in 1978. He was married to June Kent and had 2 children. Michael J. Smith was the pilot. He was born on April 30th, 1945 in North Carolina. Smith graduated from the Naval Academy in 1967 and served as a naval aviator and test pilot, logging over 4,300 hours. He was selected by NASA in 1980, and he was married to Jane Smith and had 3 children. Ronald McNair was a mission specialist. He was born on October 21st, 1950 in South Carolina. He was a physicist and a very accomplished saxophonist who loved playing the saxophone. He earned his PhD in physics from MIT in 1976 and was selected as a NASA astronaut in 1978. He was married to Cheryl Moore and he had 2 children. Ellison Onizuka was a mission specialist. He was born June 24th, 1946 in Hawaii. He was the first Asian American in space. He earned a bachelor's and master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado, and he served as a test pilot in the U.S. Air Force before joining NASA in 1978. He was married to Lorna Yoshida and had 2 daughters. Judith Resnick, the other mission specialist, was born on April 5th, 1949 in Ohio. Resnick was an electrical engineer and the second American woman in space. She earned her PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. Resnick was selected as a NASA astronaut in 1978 as well. She was known for her musical talents, particularly for being able to play the piano. Gregory Jarvis was a payload specialist. He was born August 24th, 1944 in Michigan. He earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the State University of New York in Buffalo and had a master's degree from Northwestern University. He worked as an engineer for Hughes Aircraft Company and was married to Marcia Jarvis. And finally, we have Krista McAuliffe, payload specialist. This is the teacher. She was born on September 2nd, 1948 in Boston, Massachusetts. She was a high school social studies teacher from New Hampshire. She earned her bachelor's degree from Framingham State College and a master's in education from Bowie State University. She was selected as the first teacher in space for the Citizens in Space program, and she aimed to conduct lessons from orbit to inspire students. She was married to Stephen McAuliffe and had 2 children. So I'm going to start with that sadness in the very up end of the episode, because these were very real people. And every episode we do, these are very real people. But this one, especially because it was so preventable and all these other things, and because there's only 7 people, I think it's just important to really take a moment and recognize them, because it's very sad. It's very sad. So the target date for the Challenger mission was January 22nd, 1986. McAuliffe was doing a whole press tour leading up to this whole thing, because that was a huge part of her job, was good-mouthing NASA. Yeah. And one of the ones that really kind of stuck out is she did an interview with Johnny Carson. Remember him?
Yeah.
Way back in the day. When she was asked if she was scared or not of going to space, McAuliffe answered, "Who was it who once said? Deke Slayton, I think. I may have been giving credit to the wrong astronaut, but they said, 'How do you feel when you're up there in that capsule?' And he said, 'It's a strange feeling to realize that every part of this capsule was made by the lowest bidder.'"
Oh, God.
And that really stuck out to me, because we actually talked about Alan Shepard who is the one who said that she did get the wrong astronaut. It was Alan Shepard.
Uh-huh.
And we talked about that last episode. And she remembered that and talked about it in this interview. And that just, that's a big, big thing. And just to kind of like recap, in case you forget, she was selected by the president to be the first teacher in space. Yep. And again, a huge PR thing. And that was her whole mission, basically. Like she trained as an astronaut. She's awesome. And she's just like the most adorable, amazing person. And she's a big part of why this disaster ended up getting so much attention, because she was why everyone was watching.
Yeah. The PR had worked.
The PR was working. She was absolutely loved by the public. And I think we talked about this last time. I don't remember, but most of the astronauts didn't really love the Teacher in Space program. And that kind of carried over into not really liking Krista McAuliffe. And it's not that they didn't like her personally. It's that they felt that the program was reckless and unsafe. They felt that sending citizens in space and trying to make space look as safe as a commercial airliner was just not a good way to deal with that kind of stuff, which they're not wrong. I understand where that feeling comes from.
Yeah, not mad at her, but like upset over the concept of the program.
Though, in the beginning, especially because there was also a feeling that by sending her up to space, she was also taking the space of somebody who had trained their whole life for this.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say they were unkind to her, but it definitely started out being less friendly in the beginning. But she ended up really winning over Judy Resnick in particular at first, because Judy Resnick realized that she really was passionate about this. And Judy Resnick and McAuliffe ended up sitting down to plan out those lessons that she was going to teach in space, because Resnick was there to help her understand what the heck was going on everything, because she wasn't trained in it, you know? And she really worked hard. Her mission, McAuliffe's mission, was known as the ultimate field trip. And despite that rocky start, she ended up being a pretty integral member of the crew, and everyone ended up really loving her by the time they were going to launch off. Then we have Gregory Jarvis, and I want to mention him because Gregory Jarvis was actually supposed to go on the December 1985 mission, and he was bumped off by that senator we talked about last episode.
Oh my God, that's right.
They took him, and this is where, you know, a lot of those feelings from the astronauts about somebody being bumped off.
Yeah.
Part of it is because, you know, poor Jarvis, he got bumped off. And then we're going to talk about another mission that Columbia launched in January of 1986. He ended up getting bumped off of that mission because a congressman wanted to go on that mission.
God.
And that is how he ended up on the Challenger. Just bad luck. On this mission, they were set to have the astronauts do things like McNair and Resnick using the shuttle's arm to launch a small satellite to study Halley's Comet, like we were talking about before, which was making its closest pass to Earth since 1910, the closest it would be before 2061. Onizuka was to use the camera to take photos of the comet and as it approached the sun, and Greg Jarvis would conduct his own experiments in fluid mechanics, just all kinds of really cool science going on there. This was a science-based mission, but the star of the show, McAuliffe, she was going to teach 2 lessons in space from orbit. Before they got to that launch, though, with an agency already buckling under the strain of, you know, just everything going on, the senator going up, all these other things, and now Columbia is supposed to go up in January. It's supposed to be one of the first times that 2 missions are launching so close to one another. And yet, in early January, the Columbia launch was scrubbed after an 18-month, $42 million overhaul that was supposed to bring it closer to where Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis were, because Columbia was the first shuttle built. And they realized after she was built that there was a few things they could change to like shave weight and do different things. So the other shuttles were built slightly differently than Columbia, and they had taken her off the line and they were retrofitting her. And this was supposed to be her first flight after that, and they had to scrub it. This scrub obviously pissed off management. Graham, in particular, was absolutely furious that there had been so many delays for safety concerns with Columbia in particular. But by mid-January, crews had worked 40 straight 12-hour shifts without break to get this launch into the air. 40 12-hour shifts in a row. Over a month of not getting a day off and working 12 hours every single day.
That's gross.
Techs were routinely skipping hundreds of maintenance requirements and in fear for their jobs if they reported any problems. Things had reached a peak of just massive problems. On January 6th, during the third attempt to launch Columbia, it was 5 minutes away from launch when an operator accidentally misread a computer signal, flipped a switch, and drained 18,000 pounds of liquid oxygen from the external fuel tank. Because tired people don't make mistakes, right?
Right.
Countdown continued until a low-temperature alarm sounded.
Oh.
Only 30 seconds separated complete disaster with everything exploding.
Oh, wow.
And the computer shutting off. If those engines had lit with all of that liquid oxygen hanging out right there, it would have been catastrophic.
Yeah.
NASA, clearly having learned from its Apollo 1 press relations and how well Apollo 13 went, decided to tell the press that it was just a mechanical failure and routine.
Oh, so they didn't learn.
Didn't learn anything. Absolutely
Got
not.
it.
Or really, they learned it and then they unlearned it. Because they learned it when we went through the whole Apollo 13 stuff. And by the time we get to this point with the shuttle program and everything going on, they just thrown all of that out the window. And they decided they don't need to know these things. 48 hours after that launch, another launch was canceled because of bad weather on the landing strips in Africa and Spain. And then a jammed valve in the main engine was found, which postponed the launch yet again, because you can't just have something lodged. In the process of emptying the tank's engines, the engineers found that it was jammed because a temperature probe had snapped off entirely on the inside and had been sucked into the oxygen lines.
Oh, wow.
If the mission had launched, if they hadn't canceled it and scrubbed it, it would have seemed normal until 8 minutes and 30 seconds in, when the entire craft would have exploded at the threshold of space.
Wonderful.
So we've had, for just Columbia in January, multiple near misses.
And this is on top of all the prior near misses.
On top of all the prior near misses, because
like, where the O-rings almost failed so many times.
And that's just the O-rings. We talked about some other things. This is other things here, because there's just over and over and over again near misses. And I didn't even go into all of them. I'm not going to go into all of them because there's just so many.
They kept rolling nat 20s on their luck.
That's really what it is. It's just constant nat 20s. So, January 10th, 1986, a fierce storm struck the Cape while astronauts were inside of the Columbia awaiting their launch. They could see how hard the wind was blowing through the windows, and they could hear the electricity from lightning in their headsets. The shuttle was protected by a lightning rod built into the tower above them, but this doesn't seem great. This is not fantastic. In firing room 1, controllers realized belatedly that liftoff that morning was impossible, but they'd been told that Graham was insistent that the flight take off despite the danger. So here they are, and like good soldiers, they complied. It was Columbia's fourth trip.
They're not soldiers.
I mean,
God.
What are they going to do? There's only so much they can do. And I empathize with it. Sure, it would have been better for them to stand up and really fight it. Absolutely. But you can understand it. You can understand what's happening here. This was Columbia's fourth trip to the pad in a month. After 4 hours of waiting, STS-61C was scrubbed for the 7th time.
God.
Astronauts waved a white cloth when they were finally able to climb out of the shuttle. A mile north of this chaos, Challenger stood on pad 39B looking ready. It was the first time 2 shuttles were on pads at the same time in the agency's history. This image of 2 space shuttles on the pad sticks with me in a lot of ways because it's the picture perfect image for NASA's PR mission of routine space travel. We've got 2 shuttles ready to launch. We're capable of launching 2 shuttles at the same time.
Yeah.
But the reality is they're having constant issues. They're constantly almost killing the astronauts. And it's very evoking of all of the things that are wrong with NASA at this point and all of the things that are wrong with the system at this point.
I wonder if all these faults that they keep finding and all these near misses are being relayed at all to the astronauts.
No, they're not. Thanks for bringing that up. We're going to talk about that more a little bit later, but no, they're not being brought up. The astronauts do not know. They know that things are getting scrubbed, and they're being told that as they're scrubbed, it's for safety concerns, and they're then getting fixed. And they're not being told about the near misses, like how close they almost came to dying. They're being told, like, this sucks. There was a safety concern, but we solved it. No big deal.
Yeah, we caught it. The safety measures in place are working.
Yeah, so as far as they're concerned, everything's going well.
Bullshit.
So they're both there. The Columbia finally left the ground on January 12th, 1986 at 6:55 a.m., leaving the Challenger ready to launch in 12 days. Its mission had been pushed back several times because of all these issues with the Columbia. So everyone is in a fervor to get the Challenger into the air and to try and save their schedule because we're not even a month into the new year where they have 15 missions planned.
Delay.
And they're already that far behind schedule. This was the most exciting launch NASA had in a really long time. And to just kind of paint the picture of how bananas it was, the area was crowded with more reporters than there had been in a long time. And the NASA astronauts press conference before the launch was actually aired live for the first time in years. In that conference,
people cared again, right?
People cared about McAuliffe.
Right? That's what I mean.
They cared about.
The
but
teacher.
Yes, they did. In that press conference, McAuliffe said, "Well, I'm so excited to be here. I don't think any teacher has ever been more ready for 2 lessons. I've been preparing these since September, and I just hope you all tune in on day 4 to watch the teacher teaching from space."
Oh.
Between the 7 crew members, they had invited 3,000 people just on their own to watch the launch. Ellison Onizuka, whose first flight had been a black flight, which is a military secret flight. None of the information is released about it. So he wasn't able to talk to his family about pretty much anything he did in space, was so excited to go back up and be able to talk about it that he had planned this huge landing party in Houston. He had ordered like multiple suckling pigs because I guess that was his specialty. And he was just going to have this whole ass luau to celebrate going back up into space. And he was so excited to come home and actually be able to talk about it with his family and his friends. Ron McNair's brother, his pregnant wife, and his in-laws, along with all of his children, Joy, who was 18 months old, and Reggie, who was 4, were there.
Twist the knife more.
Sorry. McAuliffe's husband, her children, her child Scott's teacher, and 17 of his 3rd grade classmates were there as well. When asked what he was most looking forward to by a reporter, little Scott said SeaWorld and the launch, and he was equally excited about both. When asked about, your mom's on the flight, aren't you more excited about that? Like, doesn't that make it more exciting? He was like, well, I guess I'm looking forward to the launch, but I've never seen a whale, and I'd really like to see a whale. Especially a killer whale. So he was really excited, and he did get to go to SeaWorld. On top of all of the astronauts guests. On top of all of the astronaut guests, the original crowd included a further 15,000 special guests who were expected to come for the launch. This included congressional representatives, governors, teaching unions, scientists from China, scientists from America, astronauts, ambassadors, and Vice President George Bush. Just tons and tons of people were expected to be there. Acting Administrator Graham had purged the guest list of all Democrats, though. Just because I feel like this is important to let you know how just politicized it was. And we think back on the 1980s, and it doesn't feel that politicized, but like it was that politicized. So,
wow.
The launch was postponed again because ground crews were still installing pieces of equipment from Colombia. Remember we talked about last episode? They were stealing from Peter to pay Paul repeatedly. They would take components from the last shuttle that landed to put into the new shuttle. So the launch was postponed just a little bit because they had to take a bunch of parts from Columbia and reinstall them onto Challenger to be able to launch Challenger.
Wow.
They also had to delay because of the weather. There was dust storms gathering around the emergency landing strip in Africa, and meteorologists were calling for a cold front that would bring rain across the Space Coast during the weekend. It pushed the launch back to January 26th, the Super Bowl Sunday.
Okay. It's crazy to think that how interconnected this is because they have to consider You
have to have good weather, basically, for the whole Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
And your landing area in Africa
or Spain
or wherever
has
to have good weather.
Yep.
Too.
It's bananas. It's really bananas.
That's some crazy coordination.
It's pretty cool. In the citizen area where people were gathering to watch the launch and just kind of hang out, there was teacher memorabilia everywhere. People were so excited about this. The teacher backup to McAuliffe, Barbara Morgan, was on PBS and other networks explaining to kids what was going on. McAuliffe's father, who was at the launch as well, bought dozens and dozens of buttons with his daughter's face on them and pinned the biggest one he could find on his lapel.
Oh.
On Friday, the 43-hour countdown started. Most of the astronauts were very relaxed, and they were finally ready to go. There had been so many delays, they were over it, and they just wanted to do it. A few were slightly concerned and nervous. Greg Jarvis, for example, finally about to fly after being bumped from 2 previous flights, told his wife, "Don't worry about me, everything's going to be fine, but if something happens, just be happy. Remember everything we've done together."
Oh, oh man.
Sorry.
My heart just hurts.
I'm just going to break you. I broke you with rage last time. I'm going to break you with sadness in the beginning here, and then I'm going to just ruin your life. You're welcome. At 10:30 on Saturday,
Saturday.
the flight readiness meeting on whether or not this launch would get approved was held. One of the major concerns about what was going on about whether or not they were going to launch was that weather. Raining was not going to be a good thing. It was going to be very difficult to launch in the rain.
Yep.
And that cold front coming behind was a concern as well. But really, it was the poor weather and poor visibility that was the main concern that was going on. Engineers reported no concern about their parts, including the O-rings, and every member at the meeting marked the mission as a go, as long as the weather favored them.
Right. Something that wouldn't be their fault.
I mean, they say that every single launch at this point. O-rings are fine. O-rings are fine. So the fuel was set to be loaded right around midnight, and that was when the final call had to be made. So at 9 p.m., 11 hours until launch, the mission management team met one last time to make a final decision. Lieutenant Scott Funk was the shuttle meteorologist, came on over teleconference and said the weather was going to be bad. A cold front was still surging across Florida, and its leading edge was set to arrive around 5 a.m., and behind it, fog with poor visibility. Rain and very cold weather. By launch time, the weather at Kennedy would be deteriorating pretty fast. However, the forecast for Monday was absolutely excellent. They ended up deciding that they were going to scrub the mission. They were going to push it back one more day.
Oh my God.
With how bad all of that weather was looking, they were like, okay, we're just going to launch on Monday. It'll be fine. It'll be a little bit colder, but it'll be okay to launch on Monday, the 27th.
Didn't the O-rings have more problems when it was colder?
They do. We talked about that last episode explicitly. And this is a cold front coming in, and the weather behind that poor visibility was supposed to be dramatically cold. So yeah, you're picking up what I'm putting down here. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
On Sunday morning, when the sun rose, the weather was absolutely picture perfect. Despite the dire predictions and warnings, it would have been an absolutely chef's kiss perfect day to launch. But they weren't ready. They didn't load up the fuel. They couldn't do it. There wasn't anything they could do about it. The delayed bad weather could interfere with liftoff on Monday. But there was no going back now. And the agency just kind of had to deal with yet another black eye. Because everyone's there. The whole world is gathered at the Cape, ready to see this going on. They saw them delay it for bad weather. And now the weather is beautiful. And it's supposed to be bad on Monday instead. So they're not going well. 11 hours before the planned Monday launch, after the bad weather had started to roll in, fuel started being loaded into Challenger.
Oh, my God.
They're ready to go. Monday, January 27th. In bad weather. Well, planned bad weather. By the time we get to the morning of January 27th, 1986, the weather was crisp, cold, and clear. It actually looked pretty good. It wasn't that cold. There wasn't bad visibility. Everything looked pretty okay. The final preparations were taking place. Pre-flight checks were proceeding as planned, ahead of schedule even for once. Then we have poor Johnny Corlew.
Okay.
Just say a little, what's that? The Hunger Games sign for poor Corlew. Here. He was NASA's quality assurance inspector, and he was consulting his checklist, and the next task he had to check was the door mechanism to confirm it had latched. But there was a problem. It didn't show latched. The little thingy mabob didn't show, like the indicator. Yeah. Didn't show latched as of 8:30 a.m. It was pretty quickly figured out that it was a malfunctioning switch. That indicator was bad, and the door was fine. It had latched, but the indicators weren't showing that it had. When the techs began to remove the temporary handle that they used to close the hatch, one of the bolts that screwed it onto the shuttle wouldn't come off. It was stripped. And the handle was completely stuck. They did not have a drill on them.
Really?
They didn't. So they called for a drill to be brought to them. It took over an hour for the drill to make it to them.
What?
And then the batteries were dead in the drill.
Come on, NASA.
So they asked for more batteries, for new batteries, and the new batteries were dead. They arrived.
Oh my God.
They asked for another drill.
It's a comedy of errors.
Oh, it's so bad. It's so bad. The second drill that came out after the two sets of batteries also didn't work.
Okay. Fate is telling you something here.
It really is. They asked for permission.
Don't do it.
Right. They asked for permission to just cut the bolt off. And they were given permission, but by then it was too late. Their window for good weather had closed, and they weren't going to be able to launch on Monday. They were going to have to launch on Tuesday, January 28th, 1986. And you can imagine how the press treated this. Because the press had
heads are rolling.
Long-range cameras. They were watching this entire comedy of errors play out as everything was going on. there was no way to hide it, that NASA just didn't have a drill.
Or charged batteries.
I just
Didn't think this might.
insane. Absolutely insane.
Come on.
Poor Johnny felt awful. He apologized to Dick Scooby in particular, who told him, "Forget it, Johnny. That's the way things go sometimes. We'll try again tomorrow." I'm having feelings. Engineers at their consoles and launch control center were concerned. The weather forecast was still calling for absolutely record cold, with temps expected to fall to 23 degrees overnight, 9 degrees below freezing, with significantly high winds. NASA senior managers met again and conferred at length. Arnie Aldrich from the Johnson Space Center, the number 2 in the launch decision-making change, gave the go-ahead to implement the cold weather plan they had come up with after the pipes had frozen and burst the year before. Do you remember the January 1985 flight?
I remember something about freezing pipes.
So that night, it got down just below freezing overnight, and they didn't drip faucets or anything, and the pipes all exploded. The main point we made that episode, or I made that episode, was that was one of the flights that had the worst O-ring damage.
Right.
By the time they launched that January flight, it was 62 degrees. Just keep that in your head. It was 62 degrees. The solid rocket booster was kept cold because of, kind of different sciencey things. That was 53 degrees when they launched that. So just keep those numbers in your head.
53 or 63?
So the weather was 62 degrees. The solid rocket booster that had the O-ring damage,
it's
because of
core temperature
all the things, its core temperature was 53 degrees. So at any rate, other than the hard freeze overnight, which they felt was handled by just dripping faucets, essentially, there wasn't much more. I mean, they dumped antifreeze in certain areas to keep water from freezing there, and they dripped the faucets so the pipes wouldn't burst. But the weather was calling for cold, but clear skies and unlimited visibility. So the launch was a go for January 28th, 1986 at 9:38 a.m.
Okay.
Over at Marshall's Operations Center, senior manager Larry Weir was troubled by the low temperatures. He vaguely remembered someone telling him from Theacall that cold weather and boosters, something about January 1985, but he couldn't remember exactly what it was. He called Boyd Brinton, Theacall's man in Alabama, who asked about it. Brinton also couldn't remember, and Brinton turned around, called Thompson over at the Utah plant, because no one is just near each other, because that's how this all works, I guess.
Yeah.
And he called him up to be like, hey, could there be a problem? There's a cold front coming in. And now it was supposed to be only 23 degrees. It's supposed to be down to 18 degrees overnight. Could this be a problem? I feel like I heard something about this. Could this be a thing? Now, Thompson was a supervisor at Theacall who served on the SEAL Team Task Force. We talked about that last episode. He was on the SEAL Team Task Force. So he turned around and called our pal, Roger Bose-Jolly.
Oh, yeah.
And Bose-Jolly immediately thought of the O-rings and was immediately exceptionally concerned because he knew about what was going on. He had thrown a fit trying to get all these things done. He was the one we ended last episode on, waving his hands around, screaming that we're going to kill everyone. We got to stop launching these pieces of shits.
Yep.
So he now knows that the weather is super, super cold. He has been one of the only people really focused on this and testing it. And he just goes into action. He calls all the senior engineers to have them try and pool data on the cold weather shuttle launches. Up until that moment, he really didn't know much about this mission that was going on, other than it was going to be soon. He had been entirely focused on solving this O-ring problem. So, he was just astonished when he found out how cold it was going to be and that they were still considering launching. Because do you remember what they had told him about why they didn't need to ground the fleet and why this wasn't a huge deal?
Because it's Florida and it doesn't get that cold.
Because that was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was never going to be that cold again. And now meteorologists were calling for the temperature at the time of launch to be 26 degrees.
Colder than it was.
Less than half of what it had been when they launched in 1985. And there was, the Discovery shuttle almost killed everyone aboard.
Yeah.
So he was astonished. He could not believe that anybody was even remotely considering firing the shuttle boosters without having more information. This was irresponsible. So he sets off a whole chain of things, and there's just all kinds of chaos. Al McDonald, who was, if you remember, the Theacall rep, who has to sign off on the launch.
Yes.
Because there's so many people that have to sign off. So Al McDonald is the one from Theacall that has to sign off for it. He didn't hear about it until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So 4 p.m. before the flight that's supposed to take off at 9 a.m. the next morning. He talks to Bob Ebeling, who is one of Bose-Jolly's colleagues, and Ebeling lays out all their concerns with all these different things that are going on, and McDonald tells him that he wants a precise temperature that it was safe to launch in, and that he would set up a teleconference with all these different NASA managers to figure out what they were going to do for the launch tomorrow. So basically, get your information together. I'll set up this teleconference. Be ready to present it. Specifically, we want a precise temperature from you. Like, tell us when it is safe. How cold is too cold, right? So he ends up
the hard no-go zone.
Hard no-go zone. He ends up having to play a ton of phone tag because most people have gone home at this point. It's after 5 o'clock by the time he gets around to calling people after talking to Ebeling. And just series of, call this guy, call that guy, call this guy, call that guy. And they're finally able to figure out putting together this teleconference. He gets a hold of Bob Lund. If you remember, Bob Lund is one of the other Theacall managers.
Okay.
Who's very mutable in his opinions.
Okay.
Very good soldier, so to speak. So he's going to be one of the leads on this mission, and he sets up a conference with Bob Lund before the big teleconference to talk to him about what's going on. And he talks to Bob Lund, and he also has Ebeling on that call and Bose-Jolly. And I guess the long story short here is Al McDonald does his homework. He gets as much information as he can and starts trying to understand as much of it as he can. Because while he's an engineer, this is not his, he has to be concerned about everything.
Yep.
And we know how many different pieces there are. Yep. The astronauts themselves, while all of this was happening, were assuming that the cold was going to scrub the launch. And most of them were telling their friends and family to go home, come back later. It's, it's Tuesday now. You don't want to have to stay here all week. We don't know how long it's going to be because the cold was supposed to last several days. It wasn't going to just go away the next day. The press was lambasting NASA aggressively because of the whole chaos with the bolt that had happened there. And it was not a good time. NASA was bound and determined to get this flight in the air. Most people thought it was going to be scrubbed, but NASA really wanted the win.
When PR takes precedence.
With all those other things happen, there was also an isolated cell of frigid air that was 10 degrees colder than what was predicted that settled over the Cape.
Oh, good.
So even colder than the too cold weather was settling in as they're all discussing all of this and starting to do these different arrangements. Shortly before the conference call started, the 2 ships that were sent out into the Atlantic Ocean, whose job it was to recover the solid rocket boosters and bring them back, went back home because the weather was so bad that they couldn't stay out in the water.
Oh, God.
We got things happening.
Yeah.
All kinds of different places. The meeting, the teleconference, began at 8:15 Florida time. There were dozens and dozens of people on the call, so the meeting began in absolute chaos. Theacall hadn't managed to finish all of its research, nor faxing the research that it had collected. So they were actively faxing out information while finalizing their equations on the last pages of the research to all these different places when the conference call started.
Wow.
It was bananas. The meeting itself didn't end up officially starting until 9 o'clock because of all of this going on.
Yeah.
So about 12 hours before launch, this teleconference call on whether or not they're going to launch the mission begins. The engineers came on and gave a very analysis of the O-rings, talked about the problems they had had over the years, the fact that it was an ongoing problem that had been seen from the beginning of the shuttle program, talked specifically about how the O-rings loses their elasticity in the cold and how it compromises their seal and how critically damages the joint to the point that it's not safe. There's a very good chance that it won't completely seal. And if you recall from the last episode, they just didn't have the funding to do super precise testing.
Right.
They didn't have the funding to buy the materials they needed. So he did not have...
Wasn't it said, like, it'll be studied, and then they just kind of brushed it off?
Kind of.
And
that's how it was
really
initially.
dug into it?
By the time the SEAL Team Task Force had started, they were getting more funding, but it wasn't enough because they didn't have a research lab. They didn't just need funding to do research. They needed to build a whole ass research lab to be able to do their research. So it was going, but it was going slowly. So he didn't have precise numbers. He did have more numbers than they did before because they had been working on it.
Yeah.
But they weren't super definitive. They were pointing in a direction, but they weren't conclusive evidence.
I can imagine how that conversation went then.
There was quite a bit of pushback, particularly from a man named Malloy, who we've talked about a few different times. He's not my favorite person.
Right.
He did not give off the impression that this was going to go the way the engineers wanted it to go. While they're having this call, at the launch pad, all of the faucets are dripping and starting to freeze.
Mm-hmm.
They poured 1,400 gallons of commercial antifreeze below the nozzles of the rockets to try and insulate the orbiter, turning the water green, and that froze.
Oh, God.
So it's great. They talked about the temperatures. They were asked what temperature it would be safe to launch the shuttle in, and what the engineers told Malloy and the NASA senior managers that they could not recommend launching Challenger or any of the space shuttles in temperatures below 53 degrees. They picked that number because that is what the temperature of the solid rocket booster was during the Discovery's launch.
Right.
And they qualified it with, it might need to be warmer than that, but it for sure can't be colder than that. That is the minimum. It cannot be colder than that.
Right.
Malloy's response, which will forever be emblazoned, it is infamous. He said, "My God, Theokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April." Which sends a message of what I care about is safety, right?
Wait. That's where we left the last episode.
No.
Isn't it?
No.
All right.
You and I talked about it after. But
that's what it was.
We left the last episode on Bose Jolly running through the halls, waving his hands, yelling that you can't launch these pieces of shit. Because I thought that was a great ending.
Okay. No. I'm remembering now our conversation after we did talk a little bit more about it. And
because I was like, you're going to be so mad. You're going to be so mad, man. So...
Yeah. When you want me to launch next April. Like,
yeah.
We want you to launch when it's safe.
We want you to launch when it's safe. But that message, that quote, what he said, send a message. And it reverberated through Theokol. It particularly reverberated through the management at Theokol.
Right, because, oh shit, we might lose our contract.
Included on this call were the lead executives of Theokol. And there's a number of different things happened, but in the interest of brevity, not going for crazy amounts of time, they ended up asking for a moment to get off the call and chat about what was going on without everyone on the same line. So they went off. While they were off, Al McDonald was basically like, Malloy, I don't know what you want here. Like, they're saying it's unsafe. I'm not going to recommend launching if my engineers are telling me it's unsafe. And Malloy was he was pretty belligerent. Like, this is insanity. This is not, they don't have any definitive proof. And it was very clear that he wanted them to prove that it was unsafe. That's it. Not prove that it was absolutely safe, which is what NASA's own regulation says you have to do. You have to prove that it's actively safe. He wanted them to prove it was unsafe. So that's where we are. After about 30 minutes...
You've been saying there's problems all these times, and we haven't had any disasters. They keep launching. They keep coming back.
Yep. After about 30 minutes, Theokol's managers come back on, and they let NASA know that they've decided to revise what they had said before.
Of course they did.
After that outburst from Malloy, they decided to change their recommendation and say that it was safe to launch. Al McDonald refused to sign off on it. So they asked the executives at Malloy to sign a paper saying that they approved the launch because Al, who was supposed to be the one to approve this, wouldn't.
Yeah. Safety
so
checks like that work really well when you just fucking bypass them.
Yep, when you just change your mind. Al ended up trying to get Malloy to change course a little bit after all of these things happened. After that was signed and sent in, Malloy absolutely wouldn't. And Al McDonald ended up telling him, if anything happens, I wouldn't want to be the person who has to stand in front of a board of inquiry to explain why we launched. Malloy didn't respond, but that is going to come back and haunt him.
Mm-hmm. Fucking better.
So Challenger was going to launch come hell or high water at 9:38 the next day. And they decided not to wake Dr. Lucas, who is the one who is supposed to make the final decision on the flight readiness, to let him know about that teleconference.
Mm-hmm.
When they finally told him the next morning, they did not tell him that Theokol had originally recommended that they not launch.
Of course they didn't.
Yeah. So the morning of January 28th, 1986.
So frustrating that they knew.
They knew.
They fucking knew. And
they
because, we've delayed so much and we need to launch because everyone's looking at us.
Go fever finally bit them in the ass. So here we are, morning of January
Fucking
28th,
disgusting.
1986. The plans to protect the launch pad's plumbing had backfired pretty spectacularly.
Uh-huh.
Everything froze. Everything was covered in sheets of ice, some of which was 3 feet thick.
God.
Icicles dangled from all of the handrails. The walkways on the gantry where the astronauts had to go up and try and climb into the shuttle were covered in ice. It was insanity. And what's even more concerning about it is when the shuttle launched off, those pieces of ice could easily break off and damage the orbiter or the rockets. And we're still going to launch anyway. Stevenson, the Cape's Iceman, called about it and tried to get them to delay the launch, but launch director Gene Thomas didn't want to hear it, and neither did Malloy, so they didn't delay it at all. A computer glitch ended up pushing the launch back by an hour to 10:38. They needed to fill a fuel tank, which was going to be hard to do with all this ice. The director, Bill Lucas, arrived before the sun came up.
Disregard.
Yeah, and this is what I was saying. They got a succinct recap of the previous night's teleconference, and they agreed it would be fine. And Lucas saw no reason to share his concerns with anybody above him. He was in charge of this particular launch. He didn't get the information from Malloy or from Al McDonald, to be fair. I love Al McDonald, but he didn't give it to him either. So he didn't have anything to report to his superiors, and that's what we got. The astronauts made their way to the launch pad at 8 o'clock in the morning. They played a poker game and had steak and eggs for breakfast, which is a tradition that has happened for every launch since Apollo missions. Cute little thing. When they got there, the temperature was 24 degrees.
It's fucking cold.
It affected absolutely everything. The elevator was sluggish. The cameras had stopped working. Oxygen sensors on the shuttle failed. One radio channel had been knocked out. The water under the boosters in the sound suppression area had frozen solid despite the thousands of gallons of antifreeze. Sheer cascades of ice descended from the top of the tower, just 60 feet from the wing, covering the communications equipment. The temperatures readings of the ship itself were concerning as well. The left rocket booster was around 25 degrees Fahrenheit, but the bottom right booster near the aft joint, which is the same one that fell apart on Discovery's mission, was just 8 degrees Fahrenheit.
Good God.
Engineers assumed that the thermometer was malfunctioning and didn't say anything to anyone. Inside launch control, ice was still a major concern. One of the engineers said, "It's kind of like Russian roulette. You'll probably make it 5 out of 6 times you do playing Russian roulette in regards to launching with that much ice. Not even the O-ring, just the ice."
So they were literally banking on luck.
They were absolutely banking on luck.
Could anything more go wrong in the planning of this or the setup?
It's so infuriating. Both of these are so infuriating.
It's like the worst case scenario.
It is. It's mind-boggling how bad it is. Because I remember researching this before deep diving it. And I made these 2 episodes so damn long because it blew my fucking mind how much more anything I had ever seen about it. Because I'd watched documentaries and read articles and whatnot, but it's so bad.
Everything is screaming at them.
Don't do it! Don't do it! Anyways, so, sorry.
I can't. I don't have words. Oh my God.
He got his little arms crossed. He's so mad. The astronauts were in the shuttle, harnesses tightened, headset checks made, and hatch shut at 9:07 a.m. The countdown was pushed back to 11:08 to account for ice and to have a meeting about it, where they once again decided that the ice didn't pose a threat for the 3rd time in a row. They have a lot of meetings to decide
everything else before this, ice is a major threat. I
3 miles
know
away.
How this even happens.
3 miles away from the launch pad, the crowd in the bleachers were freezing. They were kind of shuffling along. The bleachers ended up looking so sparse because so many people had been sent home. NASA moved Scott McAuliffe's kids, 3rd grade class, into a different set of bleachers and put up a big sign over them congratulating her on going into space. So they had an absolute front row seat. The astronauts' families were on a roof near the rocket launch to watch it away from most of the press and things going on. Inside of the mission control at the Cape, the families hadn't quite made it up to the roof yet for the launch. Inside, Joy and Reggie McNair, Ron McNair's children, were in mini astronaut jumpsuits playing on the floor. Joy and Carolyn McAuliffe was hanging out.
Lay it on thick, Katie.
Flying a little plastic space shuttle, running around on the inside.
I'm gonna fucking cry.
I cried a lot, actually, reading these books. And I know I'm giggling, but I'm sad giggling. Most of the people who were watching this were school children in their classrooms because it's now a Tuesday. They're not launching on a Sunday like they had hoped, but there's a teacher in space. So there were millions of people watching, and like my dad watched it. There were certainly plenty of adults who were watching it live, but the vast majority of them were children in school. So just, know that. Outside, crews were still trying to knock off ice. The bottom right booster rocket was still in the shade, so it was still quite cold. That bottom booster rocket had a 30-foot line of ice an inch thick between it and the strut holding it to the orange fuel tank. So it's fine. Inside the control, we're ready for launch. FIDO is a go. GNC is a go. INCO is a go. Surgeon, it's a go. Capcom, it's a go.
Fuck each and every one of you.
Jesse Moore, Arnie Aldrich, and Gene Thomas met and made the final call. Mission was a go. Terminal count, 9 minutes. At this point, this is when the astronaut families were led out onto the top of the building. They would have a straight and clear view to the Challenger liftoff. At Morton Thiokol plant in Utah, some of the solid rocket team had gathered to watch the launch. Roger Bose-Jolly and Bob Ebeling sat together holding hands. In the control room, Al McDonald kept one eye on the monitor showing the chamber pressure and one on the screen showing the shuttle. Behind him, senior NASA managers Moore, Aldrich, Lucas, and Abby turned to gaze out the massive glass wall towards Challenger, and nearby, Larry fucking Malloy stood with his headset on. The children in the grandstands and the astronaut children on the roof chanted with the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bob Ebeling and Roger Bose-Jolly moved closer to each other. The Challenger lifted off at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with a 150-foot tongue of flame behind it, and expanding gases pushed through each of the 6 field joints, flexing them completely open. Sheets of ice more than 3 feet across tumbled off the launch gantry. Bose-Jolly and Ebeling thought they had dodged a bullet when the Challenger lifted up off the launch pad. Everyone did who knew about the O-rings, because the concern was that it would explode on launch. They thought they had dodged a bullet.
If that's your fucking thought process, you shouldn't have launched in the first place.
I mean, please remember, Bose-Jolly and Ebeling worked very hard to make this not happen.
They did.
They had no control over it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were relieved that they were wrong at that moment, because they had no control. There's nothing they could have done. Next week, we're going to be talking about some places in the Columbia disaster where engineers didn't speak up because they were scared. But in this case, Bose-Jolly, Ebeling, all the engineers really on that SEAL team task force and all the engineers that had come across the O-ring failures did speak up. They spoke up loudly. They did everything they could. It wasn't enough.
Shut down.
They got shut
by absolute fucking pricks.
Yep.
Who honestly have no fucking business being involved.
Yep.
In this or in any safety issue.
100%. In the bottommost right-hand booster rocket, the seal did not close at all. Hot gas more than 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit blasted past the primary seal and broke through the secondary seal too, vaporizing portions of both O-rings as it went. Unseen by the crowd or mission control, burning grease, insulation, and rubber and smoke all burst out of the ruptured joint at about the same time Judy Resnick gave out a jubilant shout of shit hot from her seat. Molten aluminum built up in that fissure that had opened at 12 seconds and had briefly plugged the leak, which is why it did not explode on the launch pad. In Houston, Steve Nesbitt had taken over public commentary. The next part of the ascent would include the Challenger reducing her thrust, and it's when the forces of the spacecraft would reach their peak. But thus far, the ascent looked absolutely perfect. As Challenger suffered through the worst of its ascent, it also was hit by the worst wind shear that a shuttle had ever experienced to this date. The entire shuttle flexed and it twisted and it shattered the brief plug that had been formed by the aluminum on the damaged rocket. At 58 seconds, an orange flame flared out the bottom of the right booster, which was still not visible to spectators or to NASA. The flame grew until it made contact with the external fuel tank, and still no instrumentation showed the issue. As Challenger increased its thrust, the 6,000-degree flame now encircled the entire external tank and burned off all of its insulation, cut through its skin, and ruptured the welds within. A gush of hydrogen erupted out, which caught a flame. Not an explosion. It just caught on fire. But that's a lot of fire and a lot of things going on. On CNN, Tim Mintier was saying, so the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on its way, after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning, it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off, and he trailed off. Because at 73 seconds, the tank lost its integrity entirely and tore apart, disgorging 300,000 gallons of hydrogen now, which caught on fire in a giant fireball, which is what you see when you watch that launch.
Yeah.
Just a big fireball going on. Contrary to what most people think, it wasn't an explosion. In fact, if you watch those old videos of it, you'll see some that have a boom in them. That boom was actually added by the networks because NASA had called it an explosion right after it happened, and no one could hear the boom. They thought it was weird, and maybe like they just didn't pick it up, so they added it in to make more sense to people, which mind-boggling to me that that's a thing that happened, but it's a thing that happened. The boom wasn't there. Didn't make any sound.
Truth in reporting? Question mark?
Right. The right booster was torn off of the main fuel tank. Its nose smashed into the right wing of the Challenger, and the liquid oxygen tank there also erupted and caught a flame, leaving the entire shuttle and main engine just in a giant fireball. Between the right rocket booster being off the shuttle and now the right wing being off the shuttle, the just aeronautical forces tore everything apart. The Challenger was going 1,500 miles per hour, and the orbiter tumbled from its trajectory, and its wings ripped off, the cargo bay burst, the air ripped apart the fuselage, everything just kind of disintegrated and fell. The rocket boosters kept going. They still had fuel. They cannot be turned off. So you see in the video, there's just the big fireball, and then you see two just trails going off, and those are the solid rocket boosters. And if you look at it closely, you can see the other pieces of debris, including the crew cabin, the wings, these different pieces of the external tank. All these things are just falling into the water at this point. On the ground, it was hard to fully understand what had happened. Folks didn't totally get it yet. It was hard to grasp what was going on. It was so far away. The videos we see are zoomed in.
Right.
It was obvious there was a problem. But they could still see trails going up into the air. What's going on here? And they're so close to land. Could they be okay? What's going on? Steve Nesbitt, who was in Houston, had not realized what was going on because he wasn't watching a video feed. They don't have a video feed of what's going on. It is not uncommon for data to pause for a moment during launches. So he just kept
He's
going.
in the mission control, right?
In Houston, though. So he's nowhere near the launch pad. He's not watching this live. He's looking at data on a computer screen.
Yeah.
So he continued on, and all the news stations are carrying him, saying 1 minute, 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, despite the fact that the Challenger was already gone. At the Cape, it was clear much faster for NASA. Everyone who was inside of mission control knew that this was a major problem and that this was a big deal. George Abbey was one of the only people who was thinking clearly in that moment, and he immediately sent people to the roof to gather all of the families and get them as far away from the press as possible, as quickly as possible, and they were brought into the crew quarters so that they would not have to deal with cameras being shoved into their faces. A few yards away on the press mound, CNN correspondent John Zarella turned to his cameraman and said, "Steve, what the hell happened?" And poor Steve said, "The fucking thing blew up."
God.
Can you imagine? At mission control, realization was starting to settle in a few seconds later. No communications from the ship. The screen showing CNN coverage started showing that debris falling, and there was absolutely no data coming from Challenger. Steve Nesbitt was staring at his screen, knowing that he should say something, but struggling to figure out what to say. Steve Nesbitt was the commentator for most NASA missions. That was his job. And he had always thought about what he would say in the event of a disaster. And he was always concerned about making sure that the information he gave was accurate. He talked about how one of the things that really just kept running through his mind was after the attempted Ronald Reagan assassination, it was reported immediately that Ronald Reagan's aide or his chief of staff had been killed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't true. He wasn't killed. And Steve Nesbitt was terrified of giving false information like that. So he's just kind of breathing it in and taking a moment to figure out what was going on. He finally found his words 41 seconds after the explosion. And he said, "Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction." And it was completely flat, which I can't blame him for. But that definitely did not come across well to the rest of the world.
It's kind of odd when you watch it.
It is. It's a very flat affect. And I get it because he talks about it, that he was trying so hard to not give false information, which he did end up accidentally giving false information inadvertently, which I felt so bad for him for. And I know when I get really stressed out, I get very flat. I get very cold. I get very we're going to deal with these things piece by piece. So I get it, but it was not well received through the world. And that is what it is. A few more seconds after he said that, he found, what he really needed to say. And with a bit more emotion, he said, "We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded," which again, not accurate. Felt really bad that he accidentally gave inaccurate information. The flight director confirms that. "We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point."
Oof.
As he's saying that, things are starting to happen. There's something called contingency at NASA when there is some kind of malfunction or a problem. Ever since Apollo 1, there's been a policy in place to lock all of the doors and collect all of your data. Just get it all together. No one's allowed to leave. No one's allowed to come in until everything has been collected and put aside so that it can be studied later, preventing anything from being hidden, any kind of nonsense going on. So Mission Control is locked down entirely at this point. They are collecting all of their data. They're doing all the things they need to do. Outgoing phone calls are forbidden. No one can come in. At 11:40, the White House Communications Director, Pat Buchanan, burst into the Oval Office yelling at Reagan, "The space shuttle just blew up." Reagan asked, "Isn't that the one with the teacher on it?" And that's how Ronald Reagan found out about it, which I just thought was kind of interesting. James Beggs, who had been deposed and probably would not have let this launch, to be totally honest, was watching it all on TV and went just tearing down the halls looking for his replacement, Graham, who wasn't even at the Cape at this point. He was on Capitol Hill in a meeting with the Republican head of NASA oversight, trying to make his position permanent. Instead of as acting, he wanted it to be permanent.
Wow.
Which I include that because
it's all politics.
That says something.
God.
Dan Rather wasn't on the air at the moment of disintegration. He was actually in an editorial meeting when the images started to come up on his TV. He literally ran down to a studio that he had ready at all times to broadcast without makeup or his contact lenses by 11:45, cutting into the morning programs with an unscripted bulletin. The footage played again and again and again all day. The families were whisked out of NASA and on their drive to the airport could still see the contrails falling and the debris falling because it took over an hour for everything to fall out of the air.
That's wild to me.
It is, but they were pretty high up. It takes a while, and when you have smaller pieces, they take a while to float down. And it disintegrated. There was a lot of smaller pieces.
Yeah.
NASA's usually slick PR just became immobilized. They stopped talking entirely to the press. They did not release any information. They did not correct the idea that it was an explosion. They didn't let anything out about what was going on.
Isn't that exactly what happened?
Exactly. Literally exactly. They said you'll get all the information after the report.
That's exactly what happened, to clarify, with, was it Apollo 1?
Apollo 1. I mean, to the core, because Apollo 1, they also said, we're not going to talk to the press until the report is finished. And that's what they said about Challenger. Like, to the T, not going to say anything. And this report took a whole lot longer than the Apollo 1 report. Al McDonald was in charge of much of the investigation that was started by NASA, and he was super not thrilled about what he was finding. They knew within 24 hours when they were looking at the footage of the launch that it was probably an O-ring problem because they spotted that tongue of orange flame that came out around 50-something seconds.
Yeah.
And it came out from the joint of the booster rocket. And they knew pretty much definitively within 24 hours what it was. And they didn't release it to the press. And Al McDonald was pissed. He did not like that they didn't release it to the press. He was pissed that it was an O-ring after that whole late night teleconference where he refused to approve the launch and they still did it anyway. And now it looks like, yep, it was the O-ring. The O-ring killed everyone on board.
I told you, motherfuckers.
It was, he was not happy. And with that lack of information, the press was just replaying that footage over and over and over again and just all kinds of speculation about what had happened.
Mhm.
Things started to leak, and just we're going to get more into that in a little bit when we talk about the Rogers Commission. But just know the press was not amused. They were doing what the Fourth Estate does best, investigating to figure out what was going on and hold the government accountable for its actions. And that's all going on
what they should
while the
do
whole
best.
next bit we're going to talk about here. There was a memorial held for the astronauts on January 31st, a few days after, because the assumption was reasonably that nobody could have survived that. It was held before the remains were found in Houston. Ronald Reagan ended up being there along with 6,000 other mourners, and there was still very little information, even by that point, coming out of the hallowed halls of NASA to the families even. They didn't know what had happened yet. And this is something that nobody was used to. Like, ever since Apollo 1, NASA had been forthright, let everyone know what was going on. So this was new. People were upset.
Go figure, when they massively screwed the pooch by just fucking gross negligence and sheer denial of information in favor of
bullshit.
Absolute bullshit. Like,
so I'm going to split the
no
next
wonder
two.
They wanted to.
Right? No wonder. I'm going to split the next two parts into, I'm going to split the aftermath of the disaster into two different parts. And the first part I'm going to tell you about is the recovery, because I want you to remember this is happening in tandem with what's called the Rogers Commission. The Rogers Commission was an independent review of what had happened.
Is it something that stood up immediately?
Pretty much immediately. It was within a few days. It was put up by Ronald Reagan. NASA started its own internal review, and they knew within 24 hours that it was the O-ring failure. And when it became clear to the Reagan administration that it was like a mistake that NASA had made, he stood up the Rogers Commission. And the Rogers Commission is its own thing. And we're going to talk about that. But I want you to know that while they're doing this recovery, there's a whole mess of politics happening that we're going to get to after we talk about it. So they didn't start recovery until a couple hours after the shuttle disintegrated. And the reason why is because there was still debris falling. And they didn't want anyone to get hurt. On top of that,
now they didn't want anyone to get hurt.
Those ships had come in. They weren't out. They had to get new ships to go out into the Atlantic to recover all of these different things because they didn't have anyone out there yet because the weather had been so bad. The search efforts prioritized recovering the solid rocket boosters and the crew compartment. Those were the primary things. Everything is important, but find those first. Those are the most important things to happen here. There were 4 astronauts that were sent to the coast to comb the beaches for body parts. That was their whole job. On the second day of the search, a Coast Guard ship found part of the crew cabin, including a helmet that contained human remains. They had ships with sonar.
You didn't really mention this super deep, but that teacher's class was sitting there watching this.
There is an entire third grade
school
class
kids
going on
across the country.
I mean, I mentioned all of that ahead of time.
You did.
It's awful. It is awful how it happened. I talked to my dad about it. And he remembers watching it and how sad he was. And I picture that because he was, a grown man at that point.
Yeah.
And he remembers being so vividly sad about it. I just can't imagine what McCullough's class, her son's class felt watching that, what her son felt, all these things.
Poor
it's
kids
so
of
sad.
The crew, just, God.
In their little
families,
suits, their little astronaut suits. That was the hardest part of doing the research of this for me.
I want to cry. I'm going to drink more.
So the sonar operations that they were using to kind of figure things out, because they had divers going and they had all these different things. They had 881 different locations relatively quickly that they had to go search and figure out where things were. So this was one of the most massive recovery efforts that had ever been enacted on the ocean. And the ocean's a big place, and it fell from very high up. And then things move with currents, and there's fish, and there's all these different things.
And they get blown by the wind as they're coming down. It's
enormous. The fact that they were able to find some human remains within a few days was a miracle. This next part I'm going to get into, this is a trigger warning moment. I'm going to talk about the recovery of the remains. And this is a tough one for me. But yeah. So they worked, they got all these different things, and it took over a month for them to find the rest of the astronauts' remains. On March 7th, divers Terry Bailey and Mark McAllister were diving off of the Hetzel shore, and they were in an area that they had been flagged as potentially having Challenger remains. While they were down, while they were down there, they found what they thought was a pair of legs pinned to the seabed under wreckage. Just white
Oh,
legs
wow.
sticking out. Bailey immediately surfaced, yelling, "I am not diving in a graveyard." But McAllister was more calm, more reasonable. And after looking for a little bit longer, he realized that it was not actually a body, but it was part of one of the space suits. On further inspection, he realized what it was under was part of the crew compartment,
Okay.
which looked pretty decently intact for what it had been through. The next day, divers were sent back down with instructions to look at the panels and note where the positions of the dials and switches were before raising it. There was quite a bit of concern at NASA that the crew compartment may not have been completely disintegrated. The press was assuming that the deaths of the astronauts on the Challenger had been instantaneous because they saw it go up in a fireball.
Yeah.
But on pretty quick analysis, it was clear that there was a really solid chance that the crew cabin, if it hadn't been torn apart, could have maintained air pressure, and the forces would not have been enough to kill them from that height.
Oh,
So
God.
essentially, the crew could have been alive until it hit the ocean. So they were told to check the instrument panels and make very close note of where those things were, make very close note of all the different things in the crew cabin to ascertain what was going on. The divers who were sent down were experienced in plane wrecks, so they knew how horrific the state of bodies and the crew cabin would probably be.
Yeah.
We talked about this a bit in our 1962 Flight 11 episode.
Yes.
Plane crashes are horrific.
Mm-hmm.
And there's decapitation, there's dismemberment. These bodies have been in the water for almost 6 weeks now. Like, it's not going to be a good scene if they're still there. When they got in there, what they found was, trigger warning, really no longer recognizable as fully human. Parts of Dick Scooby, Mike Smith, Greg Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe were still strapped into their seats, identifiable by their name tags only. Judy Resnick had been carried by a current and was snagged in a cable. They found only Rob McNair's boot. Krista McAuliffe was able to be retrieved from under the water along with Judy Resnick, but the rest would need to be retrieved once the crew cabin was lifted out of the water.
Ooh.
They took note of all of the instrument panels. They didn't know what it meant, but they took note of it all. James Baggin, another astronaut and also a surgeon, was on the Coast Guard ship that was doing this to collect the remains and really do service for the bodies and pay tribute to his fallen companions. And he took quite a bit of care in their remains. The families were told by NASA, along with most of the rest of the world, that the bodies had been vaporized in the disaster. So it was a relief to most of them that the bodies had been found and could be buried. Unfortunately, as the super trigger warning here, as the compartment was pulled up out of the water, Gregory Jarvis's body fell out of it and was taken away by the current. A Navy sailor who was on the ship, when he realized what was happening, jumped into the water and tried to get to the body, but wasn't able to. And ultimately, the largest part of his body that was able to be recovered was a piece of his pelvis.
Good God.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's such a bad one. So on analysis, the debris of the crew cabin showed that it had in fact remained almost entirely intact the entire way down. The forces that it would have been subjected to were not enough to kill them. They were potentially enough to render them unconscious, but not necessarily. And as they looked through these broken pieces, they realized that a number of the switches had been switched from different positions than they should have been for launch, indicating that at least a few of the crew members were alive when it went down.
Wow.
They also found that several of the emergency air packs had been activated and used. There would have been no reason to activate these unless in the case of an emergency. Mike Smith's in particular, when they analyzed how much air had been used of it, it showed that somebody had been breathing it fully for a total of 2 minutes and 45 seconds, the length of time that it took for the crew compartment to fall into the Atlantic Ocean. So there is unfortunately a good chance that more than one of these astronauts were alive and watching as the green blue of the Atlantic Ocean rushed up at them, unable to do anything about it because there's no ejection seats. There is no emergency escape system.
Right.
Nobody is wearing parachutes. There is absolutely nothing they can do. And I don't know what's more horrifying, the people who were in the front who were able to see the Atlantic rushing up at them, or the people in the back part of the crew cabin who would have been in complete darkness they had no windows in the back part. So they would have had just no clue what was going on. Mike Smith's air pack had to have been turned on by one of the other astronauts. Where the air pack's switches was on the back of their seats.
Okay.
So the ones that were on, somebody else turned them on. So the crew was turning on things for each other. They were doing things for each other when it went down after this disaster. And it's awful. For Mike Smith, it showed the only person it could have been was Onizuka to turn his on. So he activated it. And Mike Smith is the only one who could have turned a number of those panels. So, yep, sorry.
Did they ever... I mean, clearly it's come out now, but did they tell the families any of this? Did they tell...
It comes out in the Rogers Commission.
Okay.
So would they have told the families if not forced? I don't know. But it came out during the Rogers Commission that this is what happened. It's a tough one. That one really, really hits me hard. This one in Colombia, because of the way they died and because of how preventable it was, it's heartbreaking. So another thing they found in the crew compartment was the tape. There was a recording of what had happened. There is a number of conspiracies about this, including that NASA has the rest of the tape that they never released that shows that they were like alive and talking the whole way down, which is almost certainly entirely unfounded, almost certainly entirely untrue. But they have released and shown the tape that they do have does record Mike Smith saying, uh-oh, before it breaks out and falls apart. So we're sure. They knew.
Yeah.
They knew what had happened. They knew something was coming. Maybe not every one of the astronauts, but at least some of them did. After the disaster, there was an escape system implemented that would allow the crew to escape in a gliding flight, but the system that was installed would not have been usable to escape an explosion during ascent. They couldn't really figure out a good way to create a system that would allow them to escape at that point, I guess, is their reasoning. So they never did fully solve that problem.
I mean, the shuttle broke apart.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the only thing that maybe could be is like parachute on the capsule. But...
Well, they did add parachutes. And one of the things I've seen out there is the idea of, again, that exploding hatch like they installed on the Apollos that would explode out and they would be able to jump out and parachute out. Because 2 minutes and 30 seconds, that's enough time to hop out and parachute down if you can get out and parachute down, which I'm not a scientist. It seems reasonable to me that you could do that.
More chance of survival.
Yeah, I think this is just one of those, the solid rocket boosters are so dangerous and all these things are just, it's too many dangers. But, it is what it is.
I don't know. Listen to your goddamn scientist.
Listen to you, goddamn. So that is my super, super bad part. We are through the horrible, just gut-wrenching details.
Onto the anger.
We're now onto anger. We're going to go and backtrack back to right after the disaster and start talking about the Rogers Commission. And I just want you to remember, now that we've gone through the horror of recovery, that all of these discoveries and things are happening while the Rogers Commission is going on.
Yeah.
The silence from NASA didn't play well. Within 72 hours, the White House was already threatening to take away their ability to investigate themselves because they just weren't saying anything. Up until now, NASA had been pretty good at investigating itself, but this is not going well. There's no solid information.
And I'm because some people are trying to cover their asses.
They knew. They knew it was the O-ring within 24 hours, and nothing is coming out at this point. So, yeah.
Well, just down to the fact of, Theocol's panicking.
Oh, yeah, completely.
At this point. And the people who are involved in that meeting are
panicking.
They've got to be shitting themselves.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what Al McDonald said. I wouldn't want to be in charge of this.
Exactly.
I wouldn't want to have to say that stuff. So yeah, everyone's panicked. It's all chaos. Reagan, for his part, did believe that while the mistake probably did come from within NASA and that them doing their own investigation would probably come up with a sanitized version of the truth, he also thought that NASA was decent and that having their own investigation, an independent investigation, would exonerate NASA better than them doing it themselves. A lot of it was good PR. He wanted good PR for NASA after this. He wanted to be able to keep the space program going, which is not necessarily.
It also kind of reflects on him.
It does.
In a way.
He ended up
and what he does with
right. He ended up taking away the investigation from NASA right after that January 31st memorial service and assigning a independent commission to investigate what had happened with the Challenger disaster. While he's doing this, the press is also doing their own deep dive with a lack of official commentary from NASA. The New York Times was starting to get tons of quotes from inside NASA talking about the right booster and talking about the O-rings. When asked if there had ever been a leak before, Jesse Moore told them that no fault had ever appeared in any test or any launch. In 57 uses, there's never been a single leak, not one. That's not an opinion. It's just straight fact.
Straight lies.
Straight lies. NASA released the video with a tongue of flame, refusing to call it a flame or commenting on it. They actually told their personnel that they couldn't call it flames. They had to call it an anomalous plume. Like, what? I don't know if you've ever seen the video, but if you watch the video, especially if you watch one that zooms in on it, it is obviously flame that is coming out. This is before the fireball.
Yeah.
This is the flame coming out of the rocket booster. It is clearly and obviously flame, but they weren't allowed to call it that. They had to call it anomalous plume, which just tells you everything you need to know. February 3rd.
Double speaking.
Right.
Motherfucker.
February 3rd was the formal announcement that NASA was losing its authority to investigate, and William Rogers, a Republican loyalist and former Attorney General, who was the Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, was the head of the Presidential Commission into the Space Shuttle Challenger accident. Quote, "It's time now to assemble a group of distinguished Americans to take a hard look at the accident, to make a calm and deliberate assessment of the facts and ways to avoid repetition." Like I said, the goal was really more about saving the agency's reputation. There was an assumption that NASA was going to fuck this up and just give out that sanitized version. The press was going to figure it out. If we do an independent commission and we just get through this, that's going to be much better for their reputation.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's what NASA had been doing up until this point after Apollo 1. That is the right road to go. And I'm fully on board with an independent assessment.
Yeah.
It's important to mention where a lot of the goals were, a lot of the motivations.
Right.
I think they're good motivations, but whatever. There were 12 people assigned to the commission, including scientists and astronauts like Sally Ride and Neil Armstrong to investigate.
So at least they had experts.
They did have real experts. They were given 120 days to assess what had happened, and this is the Rogers Commission. The entire fleet had to remain grounded until it was done, if not longer. And I'm not going to go into a ton of crazy detail on the Rogers Commission just because we've already gone through it all. They're figuring out all this stuff, right?
Yeah, we know the details.
We do. So it actually started pretty well for NASA. There was a lot of remorse shown from the committee. Clearly, they felt like NASA had just had a really bad day. Clearly, especially like the Sally Rides and Neil Armstrongs thought NASA had been doing what they should be doing. And this was just a bad thing that happened that can happen to anyone because, it's been how many years since Apollo 13 and they haven't had a major disaster. They don't know all of these things that had been going on. And the people who were testifying initially were just not being forthcoming whatsoever. They were not telling them all of these different things. There was a very, camaraderie sense going on between the people who were presenting things to the commission and the commission. It felt very friendly. Bose Jolly, when he saw that the commission was happening and kind of saw what was going on with everything, collected all of his documentation and hid it.
He's the guy from Theocall.
He's the guy from Theocall who went screaming with his arms.
Yeah.
This is shit. Yep. He's a big part of the story. He hid all of his stuff, though, and called it a smoking gun because he was worried that somebody was going to take all of his research from the SEAL team and get rid of it, make it disappear.
Yeah.
So he had it under like his pillow, and he was filled with both remorse and rage and just not in a super great place emotionally. It was not good. Theocall, when they were presenting to the commission, basically was talking about every possible explanation other than cold weather. It was obvious to the commission from the beginning that it was the O-ring, but everyone's avoiding cold weather with the O-ring. This is one of the first times that CNN broadcast live proceedings. The Rogers Commission was on basically 24/7. This is the beginning of like 24/7 news, one of the first big proceedings that was just constantly, every time it was on, it was airing on CNN. It's there. It's there. This is pre-Fox News. Just interesting. Well, pre-Fox News being super crazy popular. As they're going, and they're not saying much. It started becoming, I guess there was some erosion, but never the secondary seal. And, we addressed it. And the presentations are showing like, I guess maybe that kind of happened, but not really. It's fine. And then, I guess we did have a meeting with Theocall before the launch, and there was some concern about the cold, but like Theocall said we should launch anyway, so we went with what their recommendation was, because they never told us we shouldn't launch.
Lying sacks of shit.
A few weeks into the commission, the New York Times reported, quote, NASA had warning of disaster risk posed by booster rocket. It was based on internal leaked memos revealing the entire history of the O-rings, including the, quote, loss of vehicle, mission, and crew due to erosion, burn-through, and probable case burst resulting in fire and deflagration. They described how the memos had been sent to Jesse Moore, documented SEAL damage, talked about the SEAL Team Task Force. And when this came out, Rogers was absolutely furious. Rogers is the one in charge of the commission. He's been told all this nonsense, and he gets this New York Times, he gets the paper, and he is pissed. The day after that article came out, McDonald was supposed to come and be at the commission. He wasn't actually supposed to present, but he was supposed to be nearby.
McDonald is
the one who refused to sign off, and his manager signed off on the launch.
Okay, the guy who tried to do the right thing.
I would never want to have to, if something happens, I don't want to have to explain myself.
Yeah.
So they were bringing him, Theocall was bringing him to the commission. He wasn't supposed to testify specifically, but he was going to be there to answer any like specific technical questions. So they didn't totally understand he was going to be there. So the briefing for the commission at this point, the testifying, was going to be led by Larry Malloy, who is the one who said, "Dear God, when do you want me to launch? April?"
Yeah.
So he's the one telling the Rogers Commission about what's going on. It was a closed session. There was no one there. Rogers is basically like, tell me what's going on. Like, what the fuck is this? And Malloy is just kind of dancing around with it. It's not forthcoming. It's not great. And McDonald is just absolutely disgusted. And he realized that there needs to be a massive change in the entire mentality of NASA, and somebody needs to just cut the bullshit and be done with it. So he ends up at the end of it, he tries to get down to the floor because he's kind of in the back, just in case he needs to be called on.
Yeah.
And he's waving his hands like, "Dude, Mr. Rogers, call on me, call on me." And he finally gets attention at like the last possible minute, right before people are starting to file out. And he sits down and he expressly tells Rogers what happened. Like, it should not have launched. It was recommended that we not launch under 53 degrees. We knew this was a problem. It wasn't mellow. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They told us not to launch below 53 degrees. And then when we got frustrated, when Malloy got frustrated, they changed their mind. And he just laid it out and laid out.
And then I said, no, I won't sign it.
And then I said, no, I won't sign it. Yep.
And they did it anyway.
Theocall at this point Theocall the whole time had been trying to adopt a strategy of say as little as possible, but McDonald just went, fuck that. And Bose Jolly ends up being called. And this is really how the Rogers Commission went from being a friendly comrade kind of situation to fuck those guys. We're going to figure out what the hell is going on here.
Your shit's fucked up and we're going to uncover.
Work it out. Bob Lund was called up and said he felt like he had to be forced to invert normal priorities. Instead of proving that the rockets were safe, he was asked to show conclusively that they weren't. When asked why he couldn't just stick with his original no, Lund was very quiet before he said, "That's what I should have done." On top of, all these other things going on, the other big thing from the Rogers Commission I wanted to talk about a little bit was the Richard Feynman demonstration. Richard Feynman was called in to figure out exactly how bad it was to deal with O-rings in cold weather. He was not a NASA engineer. He wasn't affiliated with the program, but he was a Nobel Prize winning physicist.
Okay.
So do some experimentation. Do these tests that they should have done to figure out how bad it was that they flew at this point. And this guy, he's just amazing. So he did all the tests and everything, but he decided that he wanted to actually, during one of the live presentations, do a live test of that rubber to show everyone who was watching this live on TV, like how fucked of an idea it was and how easy it would have been for them to figure it out. So he brought some of the rubber from like the same kind of rubber that the O-ring, dipped it in ice water, and then showed how not elastic it was on live TV. That simple.
That
he's
fucking
just like,
simple.
If I could do this in, 2 seconds, why the hell didn't any of you do this? Like, you don't need crazy fancy equipment. And I felt kind of bad for Bose Jolly at that point, because it's kind of like the whole, NASA designs this super crazy awesome pen because regular ballpoint pens don't
write in space, yeah.
And the Russians sent them with pencils.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. But it was a really interesting point of all of this. And one of the things he said, which I want you to remember, stick in your little brain for later, as he's going through all of these different things, he said, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations.
No fucking shit.
For nature cannot be fooled. That's our quote for next week.
That's awesome.
You're welcome. After he did that whole demonstration and he talked about all these different things, the quote he said after it on live TV was, "I believe that this has some significance to our problem," showing up the O-ring as it's not bending the way it should. Malloy, through all of this, remained stubborn and self-confident. If you watch some of the documentaries that show him later, he never really apologized. He never felt bad about what he did. He really didn't seem to care. Just really didn't seem to think that he had made a mistake. Even in 2020, which is the most recent documentary I watched that has an interview of him, he said that he would still do the same thing today if given the same choices. So that's super great.
Kidding.
During the Rogers Commission, another man who was on it was General Kutyana, and he was his big, bone to pick. One of them was that they did not run any of this past the astronauts.
Yeah.
And he was particularly pissed at Malloy because Malloy was so unapologetic. And he was mad that they didn't even give the astronauts the option of making their own decision, their own informed choice. So he asked Malloy, "Larry, if this were an airplane, an airliner, and I just had a 2-hour argument with Boeing on whether or not the wing was going to fall off or not, I think I would tell the pilot."
Right.
Which is so just very fucking true. Many of the astronauts found out about the O-ring problems from the hearings themselves, including Sally Ride, who had ridden the shuttles multiple times, first woman in space, first American woman in space. Neil Armstrong found about it there. And they were just they were pissed. They were coming out are you fucking kidding me right now?
Yeah. I'd be pissed too. I mean, you killed my friends.
Right.
You almost killed me. How many fucking times?
That's it. One of them in particular, Hank Hartsford, who had commanded the 1984 flight in which 2 O-rings had shown signs of erosion, was so astonished that he broke that normal code of conduct and spoke to the press aggressively about how angry he was. Chief astronaut John Young, who was one of the people who flew Columbia on her first mission, was so pissed. He ended up writing just incredibly spicy memos to George Abbey and copied them to every single astronaut, along with several newspapers. One of the quotes from them was he listed all of the different things that had gone wrong and all of the things that he was mad about in this memo. And he said, "This list proves to me that there are some very, very lucky people around here."
Damn.
And he sent that to the press, bananas. When the hearings finally came to an end, NASA was completely demolished reputation-wise, along with more.
Oh, yeah.
The Rogers Commission said, "You will remember that I did say at one point we thought that the decision-making process may be flawed. I believe I am speaking for the whole commission when I say that it is flawed, completely flawed." That's the Rogers Commission talking about.
I mean, that's putting it lightly.
So in their report, they listed that the primary cause of the disaster was failure of the right solid rocket booster's O-ring due to cold weather, with contributing factors of NASA's culture of normalizing risk, managerial process to launch, and lack of clear safety protocols for addressing recurring O-ring and other damages. The panel also covered other persistent engine problems that had been known by NASA and likely would have led to a disaster themselves at the rate NASA was going, along with a number of other things. Feynman believed that the final report that was released on June 9th was not mean enough.
Who?
Feynman's the one who did the dip it in water, ice water.
Okay, the physicist.
Yeah, physicist. He did not think the report was mean enough.
Okay.
He didn't think it was aggressive enough. And I read the report. The report's pretty aggressive.
Okay.
But even so, I dig it.
Yeah.
Say it as loud as you want. And he got into a little bit of an argument with Rogers about it, and they finally agreed that he would be allowed to write an appendix to it that was meaner, which I love. I love it. In that, he ended up talking about, or he said, quote, It would appear that, for whatever purpose, be it for internal or external consumption, the management of NASA exaggerates the reliability of its product to the point of absolute fantasy. He compared their insistence on flying after the O-ring damage on Discovery akin to Russian roulette. He wrote actually in the report, quote, "If you hold a gun to your head and shoot and don't kill yourself, a man would be foolish to say, let's spin it again." That's
Right?
in his appendix, which is just amazing. There were absolutely no criminal proceedings.
You're fucking kidding.
No one had any criminal proceedings. Just fantastic.
Did they get fired?
So
Because there's a whole bunch of people that should have been fucking fired.
We're going to get to
at
that.
the very least.
There were civil lawsuits. Ronald Kirst ended up representing a number of the families, and he actually represented Gus Grissom's widow after Apollo 1. The family's public reactions varied pretty drastically. June Scooby took a pretty typical line of astronaut wives still supporting the program. Others didn't. Like, I cannot imagine their trauma.
Right.
So I don't think anything that came from them, I can blame them in any way, shape, or form. It just,
No.
they did what they could
Absolutely.
to deal with the situation in front of them. There were a number of reforms that were instituted at NASA, including safety protocols and decision-making processes. They created a new shuttle safety office that was supposed to deal with all these different things. They redesigned the solid rocket booster joints. They added heating elements for cold weather launches, particularly on that solid right rocket booster, which I'm not going to get into crazy details, but like that one was always colder because of where it was compared to the oxygen tank.
Okay.
And it was just because of where it was on it, it was always colder. It took almost 3 years before another shuttle was launched again. Discovery was the first one. It was equipped with a new escape system and redesigned solid rockets. When it touched down, it was met by nearly 38,000 people and a band playing the Star Spangled Banner. Welcome back, Discovery banner, going all these different things. They're off again. George Abbey was dismissed from his position, and by dismissed from his position, I mean he was just moved to D.C., still a part of NASA, but not directly in the line.
I hate that shuffle.
We like George Abbey overall. I just point that out because that is what happened to a number of the people who were problems in this decision-making process.
No, I'm aware. I'm talking about that shuffle in general where like it appears like they've been removed, but not really.
And that's what happened to most of the people involved in this, is they just kind of got shuffled around. So that's fine. We're good. George Abbey ended up making his way back to the Cape in 1994. And he retired in January 2003, which is a month before the Columbia disintegrated over East Texas. The loss of Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian astronaut, deeply affected the American public. The Teacher in Space program was put on hold, and NASA faced intense scrutiny over its institutional arrogance and its absolute lack of accountability. The Challenger remains a cautionary tale in aerospace engineering, and it emphasizes the importance of listening to the people who know what they're talking about. Listen to the engineers, the people who are actually dealing with this shit. Don't listen to the middle managers. Don't listen to your launch schedule. Don't listen to the pressure. Don't even listen to the money. When it comes to safety,
err on the side of caution.
Listen to the people who know what they're talking about, because the engineers for this disaster were speaking up and nobody listened. You need to listen to them.
Yeah.
I love you. The Challenger accident has been used as a case study for subjects all the way from engineering safety, the ethics of whistleblowing, communications and group decision-making, and the dangers of groupthink. Roger Bosjali and Alan McDonald became motivational speakers who advocated for responsible workplace decision-making process and ethical engineering. They toured the country. That's a lot of what they did after this disaster, not working for NASA. And I think it made a big deal. The disaster did reshape NASA culture for
a little while,
a bit, but similar systemic failures contributed to the Columbia disaster in 2003. STS-107 is the disaster we will be talking about next week. And we'll see if I make another 2-hour episode, because I did not meet my goal of under 2 hours. I'm sorry, but not really. Sorry, not sorry. How are you doing? Did I break you?
I'm angry not only because this kind of stuff always stirs me up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not only because of the tragedy, the preventable tragedy and all the issues there that we just talked about, but I see that kind of shit still.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's not gone. It still exists. It's quite prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me so angry. The
very
lack
frustrating.
of the lack of listening to people who know what they're doing, who know what they're talking about, who have the courage to speak up about it.
And it is courageous to speak up. It's very hard in these hostile environments to speak up.
And when you're repeatedly basically told to sit down and shut up, and no, that's not really an issue, or whatever. And it's hard to continue to voice your concerns or the problems. So props to the people who continue to do so. It's even harder for people coming into the organizations when they see that happening and see people getting shunted and shut down, and sometimes worse, like negative reactions happen to these people. They don't want to They don't want to speak up because it can happen to them.
Yep.
So, and I'm not saying it's all bad, and that this is so pervasive that it's we're all at risk or whatever. No, but I'm saying I see it still, and when I see it, it makes me so very, very angry. And
we see it a lot in these kind of like industrial man-made disasters. It's a tale as old as industrial disasters.
Absolutely.
That people knew that this was a problem. I mean, we talked about it at length a lot in Abervan, where it was known, and people did their best to speak up. And I think Challenger is...
It's what happens when you have the people in charge so far removed from the people that it affects.
Yep.
And the people that are actually working with whatever it is. And that the people are only concerned with money or deadlines or whatever. Everything's just numbers to them.
I think I did break you.
Yeah,
I think that is the most you've said in like one paragraph on this podcast. You are fired up. Spicy.
I'm going to need another drink is what I'm going to need.
The Challenger and Columbia are both so frustrating for those things. And they're frustrating in different ways. Columbia, I won't spend nearly as much time talking about what they knew because we know they know. We know they know.
And I'm going to stop my rant too, because I will go on and on and on.
It's a lot. It's a big one. For you guys listening, if you're just as mad, let us know. I hope you enjoyed learning. I hope all of you, including Arin, enjoyed however much you can enjoy something like this, learning the history of the Challenger, because it is...
Trying to pull myself back. I'm so mad I can't even joke right now.
It's a deep dive we did the last 2 weeks, and it's a lot, and it's very upsetting. And especially when you think about... I brought up the families because it is heart-wrenching, but it also it puts the human face on this, and talking about how the bodies had to be recovered puts a human face on what this inaction, what this atmosphere did, and the consequences of that behavior.
I think that's very important, and I'm glad you did that, because it's what people need to be grounded.
Yeah, I hope so.
And just like we talked about with anyone entering into for the astronaut program, where they made them listen to the recording of the Apollo 1 astronauts when they...
I will say, I have a buddy who went through the Air Force Cadet Academy. I forget what it's called, but they study the Challenger at these military installations and talk about the failures that happened there. And I know we both have big feelings about these things, but it is actively studied, or it was actively studied at military academies for that reason, to try to avoid these kinds of issues, because it is... Both this and the Columbia are such important examples of making sure that you follow that proper decision-making chain.
When you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it.
You're doomed to repeat it. So,
and not just that one. We've mentioned there's one coming up that I'm going to do on the Forestall disaster, the Forestall fire. That's studied in the Navy too. Everyone who goes through basic training has to watch a documentary on it. So those things are being studied and passed down and tried to, those lessons learned.
And I do think things have gotten better
passed down
in a lot of places in regards to that. This is so blatant. So blatant.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so obviously dangerous to people's lives. And there's still a lot of things that are dangerous, but not kill multiple people.
Yeah.
But we should probably talk about our social media.
Yes.
if you have as strong of feelings about us, let us know. We would love to talk about it. Arin in particular would love to rant at anyone who is willing to listen to him rant for longer about this and hear about how upset they are. So hit us up. We are pretty much everywhere. We're on Threads. We're on TikTok, as long as TikTok is still there. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Blue Sky. We're on X. We're on X. Our website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. We have the show notes there. There is several books listed because I read multiple books for these episodes. They are very, very good. We're actually going to talk about the Challenger book that I read next week because the author from one of the Challenger books I read comes into play in the Columbia disaster.
Oh, wow.
She was a social psychologist. I forget exactly, sociologist maybe. But she wrote a book all about the groupthink and everything.
Yeah.
So when the Columbia disaster happened, she ends up presenting at that commission, talking about I wrote this whole ass book.
No one read it? Question mark?
Spoiler alert. She talked about how the Navy got in contact with her to talk about it, giving a presentation to how to prevent groupthink. The Army did. The Marines did. Multiple corporations did. Her old high school boyfriend did. But NASA never did.
Oh.
Never got in contact with her. So, that's what you have to look forward to next week. It's not going to get any better. It's probably never going to get better on this podcast, but that's all right. We love you anyway.
This is what we do, okay?
This is what we do. Our email is catastrophechroniclespod@gmail.com. If you would like to donate to Arin's tequila, there's a tip jar linked everywhere. But really, if you would like to help financially support the pod, we would love it. We appreciate it. I spend a lot of money on research materials, probably more than I should. And having some of that covered would be nice. So the tip jar is there. Don't feel obligated. We love you no matter what. And with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.